This is one of those moments where you stop, rewind the clip, and say, wait, did he really just say that out loud? Because what started as another Trump press conference suddenly turned into something much bigger, much louder, and much more unsettling for people far beyond the United States, especially in Canada. And here's the thing most people missed in the initial reaction. This wasn't just about Venezuela. It wasn't just another round of tough talk or chest-thumping foreign policy language. From the perspective of many Canadians watching this unfold, this sounded like a preview, a warning shot, a declaration of intent, and the reaction north of the border has been anything but calm. Let's start with the moment that set everything off. Donald Trump steps up to the podium
and the Monroe Doctrine is a big deal, but we've superseded it by a lot, by a real lot. They now call it the Donro Document. I don't know. It's Monroe Doctrine. We sort of forgot about it. It was very important, but we forgot about it. We don't forget about it anymore. Under our new national security strategy, American dominance in the Western Hemisphere will never be questioned again. Won't happen.
Starts talking about what he calls the Donro Doctrine. His words, not mine. A rebranding in his framing of the old Monroe Doctrine, which historically was about keeping European powers out of the Western Hemisphere. But Trump doesn't talk about history or restraint. He talks about dominance, American dominance. He says it plainly. Under his vision, American dominance in the Western Hemisphere will never be questioned again. That phrase alone sent alarm bells ringing in Ottawa. Because dominance is not the same thing as cooperation. It's not the same thing as alliances. And it's definitely not the same thing as respecting sovereignty. Here's where things get interesting. If you've been paying attention over the last year, this language didn't come out of nowhere. Trump has been steadily escalating this idea that borders are negotiable if he doesn't like them, that sovereignty is conditional if it gets in the way of what he wants. A year ago, there was that New York Post cover that people are now resharing everywhere. Trump pointing at Canada labeled 51st State, Greenland labeled Our Land, the Gulf of Mexico rebranded as the Gulf of America, the Panama Canal turned into a MAGA pun. At the time, a lot of people laughed it off. They said it was trolling, hyperbole. Trump being Trump. But that's not how it's being interpreted now. Because when you line up those jokes with his recent statements, with the way he's talking about Venezuela, with the way he casually discusses taking control of strategic regions and resources, the tone changes. What once sounded like bluster now sounds like a worldview. And from the Canadian perspective, that worldview is deeply concerning. Most people in Canada grew up assuming the United States was a stable, predictable ally. Sometimes annoying, sometimes overwhelming, but ultimately bound by shared rules and institutions. That assumption has taken a serious hit. What really intensified the reaction was how Trump talked about Venezuela's opposition leader, Maria Corina Machado. Now, let's slow down here, because this part matters. Machado is widely recognized internationally as a major opposition figure to Nicolás Maduro. She's been praised by multiple democratic governments. She's been framed by many commentators as a symbol of resistance to authoritarianism in Venezuela. So when reporters asked Trump whether he had spoken with her or whether he supported her leadership, people expected at least a nod toward democratic legitimacy. That's not what they got. Trump dismissed her outright, said she didn't have respect in her own country, said it would be very tough for her to lead. No praise, no mention of democracy, no acknowledgement of human rights concerns. And here's the part most people misunderstand. It's not just that he criticized her. Politicians criticize foreign leaders all the time. It's what he emphasized instead. He talked about oil. He talked about resources. He talked about control. That's where the tension really comes from. Because if this were about democracy, you'd expect the language to reflect that. You'd expect references to elections, legitimacy, popular support, political prisoners. Instead, the framing was transactional, strategic, extractive. From the reactions I've seen, that's what really set people off in Canada. Canadian officials and commentators have not exactly been fans of Maduro. Canada has criticized Venezuela's human rights record for years. But there's a difference between opposing a regime and endorsing the idea that a powerful country can simply impose its will because it wants what another country has. That difference matters a lot to Canadians, especially given their own geography. This is where history starts creeping back into the conversation. Canada has always lived with the reality of being next door to a superpower. For most of modern history, that relationship has been managed through institutions, trade agreements, and mutual restraint. The idea that the U.S. might openly talk about absorbing Canada as a state was unthinkable not that long ago. Now it's something Trump has said repeatedly, even if sometimes with a smirk, and Canadians aren't laughing anymore. In my view, this is where Trump may have fundamentally misread the situation. There's a tendency in American political media to assume Canada is passive, polite, unwilling to push back. That stereotype is deeply ingrained, but it's also misleading. When Canadian political figures started responding to Trump's comments, the tone wasn't panic, it was determination. One voice that's been particularly outspoken is Charlie Angus, a longtime Canadian political figure and activist. He's been blunt about what he sees happening. Angus has argued that what Trump is doing isn't traditional diplomacy at all. In his view, it's coercion politics, pressure without legitimacy, power without consent. Whether you agree with that framing or not, it's resonating with a lot of people. What's changed over the past year is that Canadians aren't just talking about economic retaliation or trade disputes anymore. They're talking about preparedness, quietly, without a lot of fanfare, and that's another detail most people miss. Canada isn't making flashy announcements, there's no chest-beating press conferences, but behind the scenes there's been a noticeable shift in defense posture and strategic planning. Canada has expanded its military presence in Eastern Europe, particularly in Latvia, as part of NATO commitments. Canadian forces have been involved in training missions related to modern warfare, including drone defense and hybrid conflict strategies. There's also been renewed discussion around civilian defense readiness, not in a dramatic, apocalyptic way, but in a pragmatic one. The idea that resilience isn't just about tanks and jets, but about infrastructure, supply chains, and public readiness. Some commentators have even pointed out debates within Canada about defense procurement. Questions about whether relying too heavily on U.S.-controlled systems makes sense in a world where political unpredictability is rising. These are not conversations Canada expected to be having. And that's the irony here. Trump often frames his approach as strength, as forcing others to fall in line. But what it's actually doing in this case is pushing traditional allies to rethink their assumptions. European leaders have noticed this too. French President Emmanuel Macron, for example, has publicly expressed support for democratic opposition figures in Venezuela and emphasized international law. His language stands in sharp contrast to Trump's. Where Trump talks about dominance, Macron talks about sovereignty and peaceful transitions. That contrast hasn't gone unnoticed. Some analysts argue that Trump is intentionally rejecting the post-World War II international order, the system of alliances, rules, and norms that the U.S. itself helped build. Others think it's less ideological and more personal, a belief that relationships are only valuable if they produce immediate, visible gains. Either way, the result is the same. Trust erodes, and when trust erodes, countries prepare. Here's the twist that a lot of American viewers might not expect. This isn't making Canada anti-American. It's making Canada more independent-minded, more invested in multilateral relationships that don't rely on any single power behaving predictably. That includes deeper ties with Europe, continued engagement with NATO partners, and a stronger emphasis on international law as a shield, not an inconvenience. From what I've seen online, there's also a noticeable shift in public opinion. Canadians who once dismissed Trump's rhetoric as noise are now taking it seriously. Not emotionally, but strategically. And that's a dangerous place for any leader to push an ally. Because once people stop assuming goodwill, every statement gets scrutinized. Every move gets interpreted through a lens of suspicion. This is why the Venezuela comments landed so hard. They weren't evaluated in isolation. They were evaluated as part of a pattern that includes talk of taking Greenland, a pattern that includes mocking international institutions, a pattern that includes treating borders like suggestions instead of agreements. In commentary circles, there's a growing belief that Trump sees the world less as a community of nations and more as a map of assets. Oil fields, shipping lanes, strategic choke points, influence zones. That worldview doesn't leave much room for equals. And Canada, for the first time in a long time, is openly grappling with what it means to live next to someone who might not see you as a partner. Now, to be clear, none of this means war is inevitable. That kind of language helps no one. This is about perception, signaling, and long-term consequences. Words matter in geopolitics. When a president talks about dominance instead of cooperation, people listen. When he dismisses democratic figures while emphasizing resources, people take notes. When he jokes repeatedly about annexation, people stop assuming it's a joke. That's the reality, and it's why the reaction in Canada feels so intense right now. Not hysterical, not reckless, but sober. There's a sense that the world has entered a different phase, one where old assumptions don't automatically hold, one where preparation is no longer optional. Whether Trump intended that reaction or not, it's happening, and it's reshaping how allies think about the future. If you found this helpful, consider subscribing. I appreciate you.